the book, and that's about halfway through the books. Some of these chapters are not as long as others, so some of this is going to go a little faster. It looks like, yeah, we're about halfway through. So let's dig in. This chapter is called Interdoc, Western Anti-Communism and Transnational Perspective. It starts off, and again, just as a reminder, these are individual essays that all kind of go along with the theme transnational anti-communism and the Cold War. And so we're getting different perspectives from different people, but they're all cohesively put together. So this one starts off in February of 1963, where the solicitor's office in The Hague, the Netherlands, the statutes for the International Documentation and Information Center was known as Interdoc. International Doc.
I don't mean to interrupt. Oh, I was just making, never mind. It just came up. The rumble was just a little slow.
Okay.
Never mind.
Sure. International Documentation and Information Center, Interdoc, was signed. Okay. Statutes to establish it. This mundane act was the official starting point for a remarkable experiment in transnational cooperation in anti-communism. Interdoc was the product of in-depth deliberations running from 1956 through 1957 onward between members of the European Security and Intelligence Services, industrialists, and intellectuals concerning ongoing threat of communism. In other words, this is where they plotted Operation Gladio. While the core of this informal community was made up of French, Germans, and Dutch, representatives from Britain and Italy and Americans were all there. The communist threat was changing, they said, and Western anti-communists needed to change along with it. Interdoc was going to be the response. Interdoc epitomizes transnational cooperation because it always functioned as a separate entity from any official body. Security and intelligence services were all part of it, though. It functioned as a state within a state. Yet they were behind the scenes pulling all the strings. Interdoc was a public organization using its own name as an imprint on all of its publications. It functioned as a meeting point, a transit center for information and personnel between overt and covert worlds, representing a mixture of different interest groups, all with the belief that anti-communist agitation needed to be improved if the West was not going to lose the battle. Its activities over 2 decades confirm the conclusion that the transnational right-wing representatives created a flexible, diverse phenomenon that is neither tied down by nationalist identities nor fixed in its political alliances. Meaning, just like we have described throughout Operation Gladio, it's a chameleon. It doesn't matter whether you're quote unquote right or quote unquote left politically or whatever, whether you're a nationalist or whatever, because no one was truly a nationalist. They all just played the game. Efforts, and if you didn't, you got taken out. Efforts to coordinate anti-communist strategy between Western nations began already in the 1940s. 3 stages were evident in its creation. The first concerned itself with self-mobilization of professionals and intellectuals determined to meet the challenge that they alleged communist threat to the West. So they're mobilizing the forces. Second, and by the way, that included youth movements, trade unions, and social cultural issues. Everything that we've come to know that they use to create chaos and overthrow governments. Second, involved the institutionalization of private activities through the creation of public bodies devoted to uniting and representing anti-communist professional communities. In other words, they were professionalizing the codifying, if you will, this anti-communist doctrine in order to use it to achieve whatever means they wanted to. And they were taking what appeared to be private entities, just like everything that we've seen created from the 1940s through today, as quote unquote non-governmental organizations, when in fact they were all governmental organizations. And again, this is the plan. They're talking, this was documented in the 1940s, people. Okay. These were often supported by covert means to perpetuate their image as private, spontaneous initiatives driven purely by concerns of active and concerned citizens. They ranged from the initially MI6 supported World Assembly of Youth in 1946 to the high profile establishment of the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 50s, backed by the US government covert wing at the time of the Office of Policy Coordination, all CIA fronts. The third stage, and the stage that occupies several of the contributors of this volume, concerned itself with the creation of new forms of anti-communist alliance with changing realities in international politics from the late 1940s throughout the 1950s. It refers to changes in the West, such as economic recovery of the Western European countries and the quote unquote de-Stalinization initiated by Khrushchev in after 1953, and the adoption of peaceful coexistence as a strategy of normalizing East-West relations. But of course, we know that was never allowed to get off the ground because they had to have a boogeyman. There was never going to be any peaceful coexistence. Okay, what motivated the circle of professionals who went on to form Interdoc was the concern, if not the fear, that such a normalization would lead to a decline in the sense of danger that communism continued to pose. And again, I don't believe that they actually believed that. That was an excuse to create a boogeyman. This bred a determination to prevent any quote unquote peaceful coexistence approach with Moscow, period. It had to be turned around and used exactly to expose the rotten contradictions at the heart of what the communist worldview was. Interdoc's mission, therefore, was to ensure that peaceful coexistence did not happen. As an essential part of Interdoc project was also to upgrade Western anti-communism from the methods and motifs of simplicity anti-Stalinism. In particular, the activities of John Paul David's Peace and Liberty came in for criticism with its often emotional slogans, pamphlets, and posters. Interdoc upgrade covered two primary principles. First, it involved method. The aim was to switch away from emotional scaremongering or negative anti-communism in favor of a more measured, verifiable, and factual-based analysis of communist society. The promotion of a positive value system was an alternative. Communism had arisen and gained popularity precisely because it addressed issues of inequality and injustice that were either accepted or ignored by the mainstream. This needed to be acknowledged and then corrected. That's why you see the move over the social welfare of the 60s. They were addressing quote unquote inequalities and injustices with the um, crime bill and all of this other stuff, when in fact they weren't doing anything of this sort. It was all window dressings. And they're explaining to you that there was an organization behind the whole thing, which basically set about doing all of this stuff as window dressing, while at the same time they were brainwashing all of us to believe that they actually did care. Because I'm sure I've told you that story several times. That's exactly what my brother-in-law told me when I retired in 2008, and I asked him what the hell he was doing as a small business owner and a registered Democrat at the same time. And his response to me was, "Well, they're concerned about poor people," and so the brainwashing was very effective. There is a close correspondence between the steps taken to develop Interdoc and the moves that led to the creation of the Committee International Defense for Civilization in 1957. It went by the acronym CIDCC. Yet there are two crucial differences that separate the two networks. One concerned the value system that they promoted, while the CIDCC was unabashedly Christian slash Catholic in orientation. Interdoc was seeking a broader approach that united all, regardless of religion, agnostic, or atheist, who believed in Western values and epitomized the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The other concerns the fact that Interdoc, as stated above, was brought into existence by a legal contract following lengthy deliberations involving representatives from the Netherlands, France, and West Germans security and international services. Now, keep in mind, back then, that was Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi, in at least one of those positions. The CIDCC and other similar ventures were often the outcome of private deliberations sufficiently distanced from the state authorities to avoid any quote unquote accusations of formal arrangements, and yet they interfaced with them all the time. Also, there was a necessary need for transnational coordination. In this sense, the initial moves of freedom and liberty, with its decentralized network of national committees sharing ideas and information and campaign materials, laid the path for what was to come. The freedom and liberty in 1956 morphed into an organization called CIAS, which stood for Committee International for Action on Social Issues. While Interdoc sought to distance itself from Jean Paul David's legacy, it would make full use of CIAS's connection that had been built up across Europe. Freedom and liberty had been able to establish relationships with neutral nations such as Switzerland, and created anti-communist liaisons with NATO and all NATO countries, as well as NATO aligned countries. The similar attitudes would later be adopted towards the transnational networks such as the World Anti-Communist League and the activities of Jean Violet. And remember, Jean Violet is Le Cercle, and that is another basically semi-secret society that is fascist and was operating behind the scenes in Europe with a lot of Americans on it to implement one world government. He was also the instigator of CIDCC. Although it's harder to tell who was really using who, all that really mattered at the end of the day for the purposes of this book is the fact that they were all networked together. Interdoc was the rapprochement between France and West Germany. Several factors fed into this. The failure of the Anglo-French attack on Egypt in 1956, which propelled the orientation of the French security thinking towards European solutions, and almost complete granting of sovereignty to the Federal Republic of Germany through the realization of a general treaty in 1955. Its subsequent membership into NATO all created a European integration. And then you had the Treaty of Rome in 1952, and the Germans were looking for full recognition, while the French wanted to consolidate a Franco-German axis at the heart of post-war Europe for economic purposes as well as political. This mutual interest would reach a high point with the Elysee Treaty signed by Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Germany, and Charles de Gaulle in January of 1963. Significantly, just over 2 weeks before the Interdoc Agreement was sealed at The Hague. The closeness on the level of politics obscured a direct clash of interests between the two nations over Algeria, almost certainly involving French covert action against German business interests during the late 1950s. The French military had been interested in using NATO as a central point for which to coordinate ideological warfare and psychological warfare since the early 1950s, which they had been doing courtesy of Operation Gladio. Resistance from, among others, the United States and Britain prevented such moves to real concerns about turning NATO into a propaganda agency. And that's utter horseshit. Anyway, but the Berlin crisis of 1958 and 61 saw these plans temporarily revived by the West Germans with a call for NATO-wide cooperation in psychological warfare. Now, and let me just stop because I want to highlight this point. In 1953, it was British and the United States that overthrew Iran using quote unquote NATO and a full onslaught of psychological operations inside of Iran. So the fact that this author thinks that the UK and the US was on the outside of this collaboration is hogwash. The inability to move NATO in this direction, again, hogwash, behind the German commitment to the Interdoc project for the next decade. 1956, the Ministry for All German Affairs set up in Berlin as a forum for discussing common anti-communist information strategies among NATO and neutral states, also partly as a way to ensure the German question remained central. Interdoc would be an extension of this kind of thinking. And again, remember in 1948, it's the CIA and the Atlantic Alliance at the time, because NATO was in the formation, that interfered with the election in Italy. So Gladio was already in the works. The stay-behind units were being fielded at that time. So just keep all that in mind. Contentious and difficulty to explore any angle of Interdoc as a transnational actor and its relationship with this quote-unquote stay-behind units, otherwise known as Gladio, established across Western Europe after the Second World War. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, as allied nations sought to copy its techniques of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and courier services behind enemy lines in order to prepare for a future invasion of the Soviet Union. The signing of the first Brussels Treaty in 1948, followed by the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, and the security infrastructure that they brought into existence resulted in a level of official liaison between the stay behind units and that had not existed before. First, through the Western Union Clandestine Committee from 1951, through the Clandestine Planning Committee, CPC, and then its offshoot, the Allied Clandestine Committee of 1957. We've talked about all of those. They were both attached to SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, which is basically the military part of that. And that is always a U.S. military four-star general that has known all about all of this time. While details of the stay behind units vary in different nations, it has emerged since the early 1990s the issue that they existed and that they remained highly contentious. Within the Netherlands, the stay behind units were known as OI, meaning Operations and Intelligence. Originally, these were two separate formations. What became I, or SAZ, for three Dutch words, was initiated already in March 1945 by the head of the Dutch government's intelligence bureau, Lieutenant Colonel J.M. Summers. O, on the other hand, was a private initiative of Louis Einthoven, Einthoven, an influential former Rotterdam police chief who was appointed head of the Central Security Service in 1946, and its successor, the Domestic Security Service, BVD, in 1949. It was only in 1949 that SAZ Chief Baron van Linden, Lynden, discovered that Einthoven Unit O had been in existence already for 3 years. Attempts by the military establishment to enforce a merger between the two groups was resisted by Einthoven even after his retirement as head of the BVD in March 1961. He was able to ensure that O continued to be, to a large extent, his own private domain. O never disclosed what its budget was actually spent on, since it has also been tasked with psychological warfare, and Einthoven himself was a driving force behind the creation of Interdoc and the situating of its headquarters at The Hague. The links between the stay behind units and the Interdoc can be traced to the very beginning. It could also be that Einthoven existing contacts across Europe through the CPC and ACC network, i.e. the hierarchy of the stay behind units, was the fact that they had been present and placed in neutral countries such as Sweden and Switzerland, and that made him the ideal candidate for getting the Interdoc project off the ground. Between 63 and 68, Interdoc was predominantly a German-Dutch concern. De Gaulle's suspicions towards the loyalty of the SDECE, which is their counter-espionage people in the French government, concerning Algerian independence caused a clampdown on its activities. The French president's desire to improve relations with Moscow also did not sit well. So again, I'm going to highlight this. 1963, Charles de Gaulle and JFK Both were working backdoor avenues to negotiations with Moscow. Charles de Gaulle was had over 20 attempted assassinations against him. JFK obviously succumbed to assassination as well. Both of them, quote unquote, coincidentally happened to be doing the same thing. Instead, the Interdoc headquarters was led by a Dutch director, former BVD officer Kees van den Heuvel. So it's VandenHeuvel, with Einthoven in the background and a German deputy director supporting. In the beginning, the share of the funding was set as a 4-to-1, with the larger amount coming from the Federal Intelligence Organization, the German BND, which is Reinhard Gehlen. But in 1969, the German-Dutch imbalance had ballooned into a 10-to-1 financial agreement, meaning Germany was basically controlling the Netherlands. And the CIA was controlling Reinhard Gehlen. And keep in mind, through all of this, Crypto AG was created, bought, paid for, put behind a fake company in Switzerland, but jointly owned by Germany and the United States. And Germany is actually being ran by Nazis still, just FYI, especially in the intelligence area. So yes, we jointly owned a company, a fake company that had backdoors built into encryptions that was sold to over 120 countries around the world. So with the Nazis, that the people like Alan Dulles rescued after World War II, we went into business with them. So the Germans needed the Netherlands as the public face of Interdoc for plausible deniability. As the BND officer Herman Foertsch, Foertsch, remarked in 1960, quote, as neutral a site as possible is desired to counter national misgivings, unquote, because them having anything to do with stuff like Interdoc would have drawn attention to the fact that their entire government was still embedded with Nazis. And they didn't want that. So they used Netherlands as the face of Interdoc, even though the Germans and the US was basically behind it. Up to 1965, Einthoven and Van den Heuvel and their German associates, BND officer Ralph Geyer, you spell his name ROLF GEYER, concentrated on encouraging the formation of national institutes in those nations regarded as essential partners. They are Belgium, Britain, Italy, Sweden. Hold on, let me get Bridget back up here. All right, let's start over. Belgium, Britain, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, and the US. The original design of Interdoc had assumed a rigid structure with national institutes functioning as the producers of information, i.e., propaganda, and analysis on anything to do with communism. Interdoc headquarters would serve as the fulcrum or clearinghouse for the network communications. Originally, the training of anti-communist cadre was going to be a central purpose of Interdoc, but concerns over this and what it might entail, especially in relationship at the national level, was a cause for concern. the formation of the Dutch Foundation for the Study of Human Ecology in 1960s, followed by the German um, basically counterpart, led the way for others. The process of finding and gathering like minded individuals, formalizing the new group's purpose and goals, and arranging for the necessary funding in each of these nations proved laborious and ultimately achieved very little. The only apparatus that appeared successful was the formation of Interdoc UK in July of 1964. Itself proved to be of limited value due to its ongoing reluctance of both MI6 and the Foreign Office's Information Research Department to commit to it. Now, I'm just going to say this because what I have come to realize is this author may have not been able to find the fact that it was effective or not effective. So they make the assumption that it wasn't. That may or may not be true. So they set up the training of management cadres on basically what to call a communist threat. And then once you figured out what to call a communist threat, they figured out the ways to counter what they were calling a communist threat. Even Shell, the mainstay of the Interdoc operation in the Netherlands, yes, the company Shell, and a vital channel for building contacts in Belgium, France, and Italy, proved unwilling to back the British version of Interdoc. It did offer, however, to back Brian Crozier, Crozier, Crozier. His organization was called the Institute for the Study of Conflict in the 1960s. The abandonment of the National Institute model at the end of 1965 created a more fluid structure in Interdoc's headquarters at The Hague as a distribution point and network facilitator for all of its partners. With Interdoc serving as a kind of a contractor, they were utilized by whichever parties needed anti-communist expertise and support. The relationship that was built up directly with the Swiss organization of Peter Sager, Sager, was called Ost-Institute of Bern, which was cooperation that had previously been hampered by the problem of achieving consensus. This new arrangement also fitted Interdoc's role as a distributor of periodicals about communist, i.e. propaganda, mostly produced by the BND, the Nazis, which hated the communists, in-house analyst, and its associated research institutes, one of which was IRD. And at its peak, Interdoc was sending out 25 titles in English, German, French, and Spanish. Subjects ranged from notes on communist and communist-sponsored activities to religious and church in a communist orbit. These are just some of the names of them. The position of top-ranking general officers in the leadership of the Soviet Union. This is kind of the crap. That one was produced in Japan because Japan was part of all of this, even though it doesn't get mentioned often, as was South Korea, as was Taiwan. The Hague, through other nations, networked the recipients of this propaganda through the government, media, and academia. Regular conferences were held in which to distribute the information. Between 1963 and 76, 20 were held in the location of Britain, Italy, Switzerland, US, and West Germany, ranging from topics of Africa, the New Left in the Netherlands, another one called the Soviet Activities in the Mediterranean, Interdoc also involved a covert action side, although it was, let's see, Van den Heuvel had a code name, Victor, and he had survived 2 years on the run as part of a resistance network in occupied Netherlands from 1942 to 44. One of his tasks for the BVD had been to undermine the Dutch Communist Party by spreading disinformation. Among its leadership and rank and file, an operation of such was a success. I guess because they didn't have that big of a communist party. That's how they were gauging their success. With this as his background, it is unsurprising that Van den Heuvel lived several lives. On one hand, let's see, acting as the public face of Interdoc's Hague office, on the other, facilitating and running behind the scenes operations with a host of hidden partners, i.e., Gladio. The first of the operations involved a counteraction against Moscow backed World Youth Festival in Helsinki in 1962, with a trained Dutch student delivering a speech opposing Soviet quote unquote imperialism. So interesting. The goal of connecting with and training a select group of committed youth to pursue political goals was a running theme throughout Interdoc's existence. From the covert trans-European Luxembourg group of student activists, that was the name of it, Luxembourg Group, to more overt creations and expansions of Interdoc youth program from 68 to 70, and the formation of JASON, which is an acronym for a Dutch word, JASON, in the Netherlands in September 1975. In each case, a crucial element was to wish to pass on to a younger generation the principles of fascism. One of the aspects of the Interdoc story is the relationship with the US. The Dutch were from the beginning adamant that the Americans should be part of the setup. Einthoven acted as a go-between between European partners and the CIA. He appealed directly to Allen Dulles in 61 and 62 for funding. And the author says that Allen Dulles didn't want to provide CIA funds. No, he didn't. But they had all of the covert funding from drug sales, and they very much did help this entire network. Interdoc could have been regarded as a European responsibility, which Europeans should have to pay for themselves. Dulles was then fully undermined as CIA director by the Bay of Pigs disaster in 61, with the CIA head of station in The Hague. Little seems to have happened under Dulles's successor, John McCone or William Rayborn. To further the relationship, neither the French nor Germans particularly were interested in U.S. presence. And again, this is all garbage. The U.S. and the CIA was very much involved in all of this the entire time. They did it through NATO. Things, because they always want plausible deniability. In the mid-1960s, specifically December 65, a CIA officer in Munich by the name of Gaither, Gaither, Stewart, Stewart, visited The Hague to assist its current operations. Gaither's report indicates that there had been operational contact in the previous years. CIA's interest was focused on Interdoc's involvement with the youth organizations, with East and West student exchanges, and the use of Dutch base for book mailings to the Soviet Union. In turn, Van den Heuvel provided Interdoc's contacts in Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland, and opened the way for the CIA to interface with an interpress news agency in Latin America. Brief reports summed up in Interdoc's relationships with Americans. Quote, business-like cooperation on no more than a case-by-case basis, unquote, which again is garbage. Whether the renewed CIA interest was connected to the arrival of Richard Helms as CIA director is unclear. It 100% was, but they had maintained that regardless of who was the director, because they do it covertly. At this stage, there had already been established a Washington-based National Strategy Information Center, NSIC, which we've come across several times. Its director at the time was Frank Barnett. NSIC was founded in 1962 as an offshoot of the Institute of American Strategy, and its financial backers was none other than the beer giant Joseph Coors, Coors, and Richard Mellon Scaife, Scaife. In 1966, Van den Heuvel made a 3-week trip to North America to pursue formal cooperation arrangements. And he got support from the National Association of Manufacturers, Stuart Baeder, Baeder, who was keen on Interdoc and was very supportive. Barnett evaded this pressure to tie NSIC to Interdoc. Instead, a new constellation of forces arose that seemed to place Interdoc at a disadvantage. From 67 to 68, Barnett linked up with Brian Crozier, Crozier, and laid the path for Crozier's Institute for the Study of Conflict, ISC, to begin receiving funding from the Scaife Foundation, Scaife Foundation. Interdoc's report in 1969 stated explicitly that, quote, to set up a permanent central office in the United States still remains the objective of Interdoc's aspirations, unquote. It is noticeable that in the late 1960s, Interdoc's anti-communist orientation moved to the right. Partners who were previously beyond the pale were now being welcomed into Interdoc. From 1967 onward, it was not Barnett, but Crosby Kelly, the public relations expert with Litton Industries, Litton, who was also a member of Le Cercle at the time. In the same year, the World Anti-Communist League was formed, and Van den Heuvel took on the role of the Dutch representative to the World Anti-Communist League. Their members featured prominently in Interdoc conferences from that period forward. It is also an important role for the World Anti-Communist League activists in many other locations like Lebanon, India, South Korea, and South Vietnam. This move, weird that they don't mention Taiwan and Japan because they were founding members, but oh well. This move seems to have been a deliberate effort to connect with the right-wing trend in U.S. anti-communism, the Vietnam War having undermined the credibility of liberal Cold Warriors, and the exposure of the CIA's many covert operations, like the Mighty Wurlitzer from Frank Wisner in Ramparts and New York Times and other publications in 1967, caused a major rethink on anti-communist strategies. You know, because we were the actual bad guys, not the communists. We better rethink how we're going to package that. But the reorientation of Interdoc received increased U.S. financial and organizational input. In 1970-71, BND, the German Gehlen organization, involvement was dramatically curtailed due to the election of Willy Brandt, Brandt, and the SPD party. They were generally suspicious of the BND activities, but and was not going to allow any dirty tricks from Munich to undermine the normalization with the East. So he too wanted to have conversations with the Soviet Union. The East German Stasi anticipated in a report in 1971 that Interdoc would increasingly become financed by the American Secret Service, and that's exactly what happened. The German withdrawal placed Interdoc on a precarious financial position through 71 and 72, so much so that in 73, Interdoc's paid workforce, at least the ones that were legitimately on paper and not covertly paid, was a handful of people. Money clearly did continue to flow in from somewhere, though. The fact that the former psychological warfare expert of the BVD was now claiming that the West should better understand and appreciate the Soviet position certainly took many by surprise, not the least of which was Frank Barnett and the NSIC. Brian Cozier's always dubious of detente as a cover for nefarious Soviet designs publicly broke off relations with the ISC organized multinational conference on new dimensions for the defense of the Atlantic Alliance held in Winchester in November 1976 as a result of this. Cozier used the event to call for more effective coordination against anti-communist organizations and demanded a realignment that placed Interdoc beyond the pale. This seems to have triggered the end of NSIC's involvement, and Barnett withdrew from the Interdoc board. Cosby Kelly was still operating as an Interdoc linkman, though, and one more attempt was made via Kenneth Adelman, Adelman, at the time with the Pentagon's Army Review Board agency and its advisor to the Secretary of Defense, who happened to be Donald Rumsfeld. In the same period, Van Dam Heuvel looked to strengthen ties with the U.S. through veterans of the OSS in New York and also Ray Klein. The Center for Strategic and International Studies became a player as well. There was another organization called the Foundation for Solidarity and Alliance, Netherlands and the US. It was called FSAN. This evolved out of a plan by Brian Coziers to establish a sort of pressure group to keep the Americans in line with Europe. Since the 1970s, saw serious debate in the US Congress concerning the continuing cost of leaving military forces in Europe. So, of course, you're going to have a crisis. FSAN duly received sponsorship from Heineken, KLM, and the American Chamber of Commerce in Rotterdam, and became the most public outlet for linking the government, the royal family, and veterans to ensure troops stayed in Europe. Crosby Kelly's continuing involvement points to how Interdoc's position became quite complex in 1970s. Out of one side, they would talk about detente while actually sabotaging it at the same time. There was a conference on security and cooperation in Europe from 73 to 75 that began having conversations about all kinds of this conversations like detente. Do we want that? Do we want to keep Russia as the boogeyman? Another organization called AESP which was based in Brussels, and it was a creation of the Belgian Florimond Damon. I'm going to spell the name Florimond Damman. He had the support of Jean Vallée, who, as I said, was intimately involved in Le Cercle. Van Dam Heuvel avoided any public association with AESP or the World Anti-Communist League, but coordination clearly happened behind the scenes because they're all on the same sheet of music. Van den Heuvel's contact with the quote unquote right in the 1970s involved the renewal of the relationship with the O and the I, which are the Gladio orchestrators in the Netherlands. Various sources point to the involvement of OI affairs because this would have required him to operate entirely in the public eye. During 67 through 75, OI was overseen by Marius Ruppert, Ruppert. He was a Protestant politician and advisor to the royal house, but his successor as the head of O was none other than Van Dam Heuvel's former wartime resistance colleague from the Albrecht group, Theo Jam van Leer, Vanlier. Following Van Leer's appointment, O's budget expanded wildly, like almost doubled. And they were financing multinationals, and they were getting finance from multinationals, but also from the CIA under the same relationship that those organizations had been funding Interdoc. And in the 1970s, part of the O budget marked for psychological warfare was redirected to Interdoc operations, meaning basically it's a fluid organization. It is noteworthy that William Colby became CIA director in 73, considering Colby's involvement in forming the Stay Behind units, Gladio, in the Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden in the 1950s. There was a very close relationship as a result of that. Van den Heuvel's associate, Karl Armveld, in Belgium and the Netherlands during the 1970s and 80s, was running anti-communist disinformation campaigns and Stay Behind network for those countries funded by the CIA. The official history of the Stay Behind programs in the Netherlands, written by a former head of BVD's archive, refers to a set of tasks for O agreed by the head of the Dutch Chiefs of Staff, General BRPF Hasselman, Hasselman, in the 1950s, which included verbal and written propaganda to maintain the morale of the population and to undermine that of the enemy. And the enemy was domestic. Care should be taken, however. Ruppert had insisted to the incoming labor minister, President Huub den Uyl, in 1973, that O did not get involved in domestic politics. And that's a crock of shit, because there is a video out there on YouTube of a guy that spent 4 years investigating the Netherlands Stay Behind units based on the discovery of a huge cache of weapons in one of their parks. Nevertheless, Interdoc could be described as an internationally active way to bypass that regulation and any other. It is noticeable that Van den Heuvel, in a period in which Interdoc's budget was meant to be severely curtailed, had the funds to travel all over the world, including Moscow several times during the 1970s. What can be confirmed is that from the beginning of the 70s, Van den Heuvel did have contact with counter-subversive circles that belonged to a wider network of European stay-behind units. No kidding. For instance, the American Society for Industrial Security and the Belgium security expert Robert Thomas and members of the British Reserve Forces Association. It is possible that this also points to direct links between Van den Heuvel, Armfeldt, and the Black Ops operations that the CIA was conducting throughout Europe and NATO in the 1970s. Yes, because it directly ties to that. So that's it for today's lesson. It's weird how these all, I try my best as I'm going through these texts to keep the overview of the chapters right to an hour. And luckily I'm getting pretty good at that. But anyway, if anybody wants to request a mic, come up and do so. Illini. Go ahead, Illini.
Hey, Colonel. I only caught the last second of Hey, Illini. But good to talk to you. Happy Thursday.
Thank you. Same to you.
If you'd like, I can kind of give you a rundown of some stuff that I've reviewed on the World Trade Center. I don't know if this is a good time to do that or not.
Well, let's see if anybody has any comments about what we actually talked about today, and then we'll get into that. SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. Did I hear right that we tried to involve the Russians in this in the first place?
No. What they were saying is that several people like Charles de Gaulle and obviously JFK and a few others wanted to have conversations kind of behind the scenes for a detente with the Soviet Union so that people weren't wasting all of their money in some big arms race. And they very much were of the mind that, and Kennedy said it multiple times, that if you engaged in trade with people, that you tend to make them less hostile towards you because you come up with a dependency on each other. That's how China was handled with the engagement of a quote unquote communist country. They decided to open trade with China, and you can debate all you want about the success of that, but there's some things that you can't debate. And during the entire post World War II, you had forces trained by the CIA, i.e., the United States, that were constantly at war with China. And we've talked about all of that. The Uyghurs being trained in paramilitary operations in Nepal and set loose inside of China, flying Tibetans into Colorado and returning them to attack internal to China, us setting Chiang Kai-shek up on Taiwan, giving him an army, not an army, an air force and a navy. And then he used that for the next, 40 years to attack mainland China. And so all of those things are true. Then in 72, Nixon decided to have conversations with China and open up trade with China. And again, you can debate the merits of that all you want. But the fact that, Nixon ends up getting cooed at the end of the day, obviously very ironic. And, was it partly because of that? Because again, JFK was assassinated. The backdoor conversations that he was having with both Castro and the Soviet Union could be part of that whole nexus of things that piss people off. And so the bottom line to all of this was they had decided Soviet Union was going to be the boogeyman, and you were not allowed to have any conversations, because any break in the ice, any indication that the Soviet Union was willing to deal with the West in any way at all would have totally screwed their everything communism is bad mantra, and the psychological operation that they were waging on all of us, fear and intimidation, to steal all of our money, to give to the military industrial complex in order to thwart the evil empire. All of that would have been wrecked, and they weren't going to allow that to happen. And so anybody that did any conversations at all, Charles de Gaulle, JFK, they're out.
Thanks for clearing that up, Colonel.
Sure.
The other thing that I'm thinking about at this point in time is, it seems to me, after what we've just been through, that we're trying to herd the cats and trying to figure out who should, how do I want to put this? Who should be at the spearhead in Europe? Of course, the CIA wanted to was funding it through Operation Gladio. There's no doubt about that. But it became apparent to me that they were bringing people in and tossing people out. So, given that fact, I have to look at it from the standpoint of, we've got a question of authority and what's going on where in this scenario. But all of that aside, thank you all for attending, and thank everybody on Rumble, and thanks for the show, Colonel.
Sure. I'm not sure that, I mean, I think they have internal to their organization a pecking order. And the pecking order originally stemmed from the UK and the aftermath of the Fabian one world government implementation. And so you have, and that's not to say it's always smooth, to your point, SR71, because in the case of the international syndicate that controls the intelligence, which then controls Gladio, you had instances, and the one that sticks out the clearest to me is when BP ran aground with Mossadegh in Iran and got kicked out of the country because they tried to coup him, and had to come hat in hand to the CIA for them to send Kermit Roosevelt over there to actually get the coup completed. And as a result of that hat in hand request for assistance, because they weren't allowed back in Iran, the UK that is, Standard Oil, not the United States, even though the CIA resources, you and I's money, was used to overthrow a foreign government, it was Standard Oil that walked away with the 30-some% of Iranian oil. And so at the end of the day, that kind of arrangement, you know, they broker deals among themselves where they keep all the profits, but they use our tax dollars in many cases to do a lot of this as well, not just the drug money, as we found with USAID and many of these other organizations. So yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic that plays out. Ron, go ahead.
I wanted to say, yesterday I ran out of time. I asked you a question about the design, but there was another thing that I wanted to ask you, and it was, are you familiar with Galitzin's New Lies for Old? You're breaking up. I'm gonna switch to my phone. Hold on. I'm leaving and come right back.
So we'll wait for Ron before we switch subjects over to Illini.
Would you not agree that no one is allowed to talk about peace?
Correct.
That is the underlying,
Correct.
Throughout all of these books, throughout all of this, whenever anybody starts to talk about peace,
correct,
they're overthrown or they're killed or
correct,
both.
Correct.
And that is kind of the focus of Gladio, but that is part of it.
Well,
or part of the focus of International Syndicate.
So the creation of chaos is 100% the focus of all of that. Yes. And the chaos begets control. So yes, you're absolutely right. Ron, go ahead.
Okay, so yesterday I was asking about the whole Zionist thing and why it's being allowed to be kind of permeate the discussion, and is that a feint for something else? But I also, you said something yesterday that struck a chord in me. And are you familiar with Galitzin's book New Lies for Old?
I don't have that book. I know a little bit about it, but I don't have it. I have not read it.
But essentially, what I mean in the nutshell is that what the Russians were going to do in the 80s. Actually, they've been planning this back in as early as the 70s. Is that they were going to have a collapse, or they were going to fake a collapse and make the West feel like they won, and then ultimately they were going to come back and be stronger than ever. And I don't know if that process is still in play, and I'm kind of asking your thoughts on this, because it's like, Russia is going to go. They were going to become a Christian country, and they were going to be almost like the West, and they were going to kind of switch places with the United States, but ultimately they were going to come back and be even more hardcore totalitarian.
So, isn't it convenient? Isn't it convenient that you can write about, here's what would be a good thing, but pitch it as a bad thing because it's all just fake? That's the
Right.
Same people that tell us that Trump is only pretending to be good because he's really bad. And I have seen this play out more than once as I've researched and come across different authors where they can it almost, to me, appears that they're going to, in a propaganda way, say, this is what's going to happen, and if this happens, it's bad because it's not real. But everything that they say that's going to happen is actually good, but they have to hedge it as something bad because it's all fake. And yet
that makes sense.
And yet all of the fake shit, they pretend like it's real every single day, and it's all fake.
Yeah, because listen, I admire Putin. I really do. I admire Putin. I don't think he's faking it. I mean, he kicked out USAID in 2012.
Yes.
Why would he kick out USAID if he was on?
Yes.
If he was on the payroll.
Yes.
So I don't know. There's too many things that go on there that make me believe that that's not right. And I think it was Perloff wrote an article, I think it was like 2016 time frame, and he said the unthinkable has happened, and the United States and Russia have changed places in the world. And I got to say, I kind of agree with that. So anyway, I just was curious. I was really curious about your thoughts, because I asked you right as you were about ready to go about the whole Zionism thing and how it's being allowed to kind of be propagated out there. And is that something that we're, in your thoughts, is that something that we're being allowed to talk about now because they're gonna like spring a trap on something? I just kind of want your thoughts on that.
So, in a nutshell, Zionism, if you go back to the origins of it, it was given birth around the same time as the Fabian societies writing about the one world government and how to implement it and how you have to segregate everything off and how you have to create these tension points, strategy of tension, in order to manipulate people. And they're talking about eugenicists and all of this other stuff. So that's kind of the background that gave birth to Zionism. And
I'm well aware of that. Yeah.
So okay, hold on. Let me finish. Let me finish.
Being allowed to be talked about so
much. I know. Let me finish. Yeah. So because there's people here that don't know that. And so if you look at the cauldron of all of the different things that spilled out during that time, and you move that forward through because a lot of people have questions about how you get in Ukraine, you get Nazis and Zionists in the same bed. How's that happen? Ihor Kolomoisky is a great example of that, and his backing Zelensky, right? You've got Ihor Kolomoisky is the one that hired the entire Azov battalion to go attack the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region. And he, at the same time, is creating an actor to play president in the form of Zelensky. So how do you get Zionists and Nazis in the same bed? Well, they were birthed by the same people. And so if you go back again to the Fabian and you look at the culmination of them creating the Bolshevik Revolution and Hitler, it's all the same people all the same time throughout history. And we just had Oswald Mosley's grandson show up today. One of the most famous Fabians of all times. I just about fell out of my chair. So this has been stewing for a very long time. And I believe that there is all of this happening right now to expose the fact that Zionism is very different than the traditional Judeo religion that gave birth to Christianity. Zionists, for the most part, are very Satanistic mysticism, just like the Nazis were. And so they are very, very different. Pro-abortion, pro-whatever. And it was the Zionists, as many people know, that were put into the Palestinian Mandate area that the Brits had in Palestine. And that gave birth to the Haganah terrorist, and it's actually a terrorist organization.
Hubba Jubba.
So let's just get him out. And so if you look at all of that stuff, huh? Did somebody say something?
What was that? Obviously a troll.
That was Bridget not getting the trolls out soon enough.
Yeah, my bad. I was cutting strawberries and didn't see him. My bad. He's blocking
I was like, oh, it looks like the retards are still being programmed.
So anyway, I think the exposure right now of people talking about Zionism and it is picking up, because I think everyone needs to now know that, because we've been propagandized in America and in the West in general to believe that all Jewish people are the same, and you can believe that they're all good or they're all bad, and that is absolutely not true. It, like everything else, has been infiltrated. There are good Jewish people and there are bad, villainous Jewish Zionists.
1000% agree with you. And I'll just ask this question, and then have you ever read the two little booklets that by Bernstein about he was an American Ashkenazi who migrated over to Israel after the 6-Day War, and then he was there for about 8 years, and then he's like, I'm out of here, and he bailed. Are you familiar with that?
I've watched a video of him being interviewed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting stuff. But
yes.
Anyway, okay. I appreciate it. And just for the record, I think you're right. I think I think the stuff about Zionism, I think it's coming out, and I think the fact that it's coming out is a good thing. It's a positive thing, and I agree that Trump is. I believe Trump is good, and that there are forces of good in the world that are trying to do things the right way. But it's just taking a long process to get it done. It's infiltration. Not you can't just go out and arrest everybody all at one time, because that doesn't work that way. So you have to do it slowly and methodically, and I think that's what's happening before our eyes. That's my opinion. And
so
with that,
so if you guys have any questions, I did a very generic overview of Zionism and I did it a couple of years ago. It's on my Substack if you guys want to go read it, at the Colonel's Corner on Substack. It is a 30,000 foot look, because when I first started doing this 2.5 years ago, or however long it was, I didn't know anything about Zionism. I knew that there was a thing. I didn't know how it interacted with the Jewish religion per se. I didn't know anything about any of that stuff. So because we were immediately attacked over on Truth Social as covering up for the Zionist, when Bridget and Cousin It and I began exposing this international syndicate that wasn't just made up of Jewish people. It was made up of Protestants. It was made up of a lot of Catholics. And I kept asking myself, why the hell are they keep saying that? And so narrowly focused, as you guys have all seen displayed here, it's always, it's somebody of Jewish background. And no matter who you're talking about, whether it's Rockefeller, it's a Jewish person, but he's not Jewish, but it's a Jewish person behind him and behind him and behind him. And so as the Swedish people are always saying, if you go around anything, you're going to get to Ericsson as far as communications go. And so everybody has their piece that they're experts in. What I didn't see is anybody spanning out at the 30,000 foot look and looking at all of the pieces collectively together. And JFK is a very good example of that. Everybody has their set mantra, and everybody says it's the Jewish people. It was Israel. It had to do with AIPAC, and that's it. There's nobody else involved. It's just that. And then you have other people. It's LBJ. It's LBJ. He had his own personal assassin, which he did. And it's just LBJ. Or you'll get maybe LBJ and the mafia. But if you look at JFK, he spent the entire presidency making enemies of everybody. And I think you sell his good short by focusing on just one aspect of all the stuff that he did. AIPAC registration under FARA was a drop in the bucket to setting Algeria free, to supporting Sukarno in Indonesia and forestalling hundreds of thousands of people being murdered by what the CIA was wanting to do, and JFK would not allow them to do it. So if you go back and you look at all of the people he pissed off, you have a shit ton of people that wanted the man dead. And I think that's very, very important. And you sell him short if you don't recognize that point. And I will keep saying that as long as I live. Colonel,
can I piggyback up on that?
Hold on just a second, Ron. Ron, hold on just a second. We've got some hands, so let's, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about something triggered for me when you said Standard Oil. With Iraq, the Chinese have gotten the oil, which I find very interesting, and I posted something in the Pill about that.
Okay. Thanks. All along.
Okay. Yeah, let's just very, very quickly run down, all of the things, the major, starting lineup of reasons that JFK was assassinated by the CIA. And just notice particularly how the fake left never, ever mentions any of them. And look at what the left is purportedly supposed to believe in. And then look how this is a pitch right in their wheelhouse, and they swing and miss everything because they're paid to. Okay, Indonesia, genocide of 1.5 million, before and after caused by Dallas. Congo, genocide of 6 million, before and after caused by Dallas. Brazil coup, before and after caused by Dallas. Yes, absolutely. Nuclear Israel caused by Dallas, but also as part of that is, Egypt wanting to share the oil revenue with Saudi Arabia was nixed. And so Saudi Arabia and Rockefellers could keep all the oil money. And that's Dallas, right?
Are you saying Hold on. Are you saying Dulles or Dallas?
Well, both. I was saying Dallas as in the assassination of JFK in Dallas. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, and also, the Cold War literally was being ended. In other words, JFK had reversed the NATO plans for nukes in West Germany. He had made the June 10th speech, basically ending calling for the Cold War to be ended. He was, making détente with the Soviet Union. U.S. News and World Report of August 63 is worried about peace scare breaking out and its effect on weapons sales for the military-industrial complex inside the United States. He was literally having détente with Fidel Castro at the very second of his assassination, with the French diplomat Jean Daniel being sent by JFK around the back of the CIA because he did not trust them on Cuba policy or on anything else. JFK was ending the Vietnam War, literally ending it. There's no question about that. If you read, all 7 of the scholarly monographs published since the Assassinations Records Review Board was finished in 1998, getting out of Vietnam. He was preventing a land war of 200,000 troops that was being demanded by the NSC and Joint Chiefs upon his entry to the White House in 1961. Let's see, what else?
That's all along. We don't need all of them. I mean, you've made the point. That is all true. And it has to be recognized. Yeah, I think that's very, very important. Again, if you don't recognize all of that, you are definitely selling the historical significance of JFK's presidency. He was and I know that we love President Trump, but to me, JFK at that time, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to use nuclear weapons on every fucking thing, I'm flabbergasted when I go back and read how often they had on the agenda the use of tactical nuclear weapons. That was going to solve everything every single time. That's all they said. They must have had a red button, and all they wanted to do was use that red button.
Colonel, their use of the nuclear weapons as a nuclear first strike was, nearly happened 3 times under JFK's administration. It's completely effing buried. And the way they do this in academia, they make the strategic nuclear studies separate from everything else when it's overlapping everything. And to erase that clouds everything and helps the left gatekeepers cover up
Correct.
the CIA coup of late 1963.
So the bravery of JFK to stand up against that gristmill cannot be understated. Ron, go ahead. Ron?
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, to your point, the speech that he gave in April, like two months into his presidency, when he literally was talking to the press corps in New York City, when he said, we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, subversion instead of elections, intimidation instead of free choice, guerrillas by day by night instead of armies by day.
So why don't you just say he gave his Gladio speech?
Yeah, but if anybody ever wants to, or has anybody push back, just have him go to that particular speech, and it's like, this is the president of the United States talking.
Yes, and he is describing in every sentence of that speech. Shortly after we discovered Gladio, and I don't remember what country we were working on, but it was it may have been the Congo, actually. And so we've got these secret armies, and we've got what the coup and the details of what happened in the Congo. Yeah, I'm sure it was the Congo, because that was one of the first ones that we found. I went back because, of course, JFK, he had been, it happened like 3 days before he became president, and he had been president for like 3 weeks before the CIA even bothered telling him they had murdered a foreign head of state. And that to me just blew my mind. And I pulled out that speech and read every single word of it. And I was it took me about 15 minutes. I was just dumbfounded, because he is describing Operation Gladio. He knew it to be true. There is no doubt in my mind. Now, do I think he knew it was being ran out of NATO? I've made this point very clear. I don't think so, because he wouldn't have put Lyman Lemonsker there if he had. But he very much knew what was going on.
And to your point, I don't think he why would he have gone to the press? He was literally begging the press to help him expose this, when they were the ones that were covering for them. It's just so.
Yeah.
I think you're right. He didn't know what he was up against.
Well, I think he did, but I don't think he felt he had a choice. I think he felt he had to keep going. He absolutely knew what he was up against. He's telling you, guerrillas by night. He knew what he was up against. He just was not going to not do it. That's how brave he was.
Oh, yeah, okay, I can get along with that. I'm just saying, okay. I don't think I think he knew the size of it. I just think it was much bigger than I think he thought it was big, but I think it was bigger than he even thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I think he knew. But anyway, Miles, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Colonel. Since we're doing bullet points on how JFK pissed people off, so I think because he wanted to inspect Israel's nuclear facilities, it's still relevant today, because they're talking about Iran again. And now Saudi Arabia wants a nuclear power plant. So I think, if we just keep the uranium like under 6%, then you're not going to develop weapons. So I don't know what the problem that Israel has with all this, but maybe they wanted to get rid of them because of that. I don't know. We're just highlighting things.
Okay. All along.
Hold on, I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry, come back.
Okay.
On. Sorry.
Sure. The one point that I will make about the nuclear program in Israel, it was France that gave Israel the technology. There's a whole big story about that and how Israel then made a deal with South Africa to share nuclear technology with them if they allowed Israel to test off the coast of South Africa. There was documentation that they actually detonated a nuclear weapon out off the coast of South Africa. And then there's a lot of documentation that there were CIA front organizations in Texas that was giving nuclear technology to Pakistan so that they could also. And again, this just goes to the whole destabilization. All of this stuff comes out of NATO in one form or fashion to all of these post World War II made up countries in order to create destabilization so that they can control the chaos and control us as a result. Alon, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, I just remembered a moment from the book that I know you've read called The Devil's Chessboard, wherein JFK, attempts to call up Charles de Gaulle and says, yo, comma, Chuck, these, quote, my CIA is helping you, your, quote, OAS try to kill you, and I cannot control them.
Yep.
This is in 1961, and he is saying that to Charles de Gaulle. And, Charles de Gaulle and also Kwame Nkrumah were extremely clear on their understanding that the CIA had killed JFK. Both of them had a little experience, perhaps, with the CIA assassinations. Like, they've seen that cloud from both sides now. And yet, our fake left, especially with Kwame Nkrumah, a hero of theirs, one would think, and once was, but it's now been never mentioned, because he makes it absolutely clear that he's, he saw one look at the Warren Commission that should have been called the Dulles Commission, and he said whitewash, and handed the commission back because he knew it was a fraud. And the other thing I just wanted to say is, like, when it comes to how much JFK knew about this, I agree. I think he knew quite a lot about it, but we also have to remember, like, it's the whole metaphor of the toboggan going down the mountain. And at what point could a president even have hoped to have stopped that toboggan going down the mountain?
Well,
because
he tried.
The CIA was 13 to 16 years old. Yeah, exactly. And he tried. And the when is also at, because what does that tell about presidents later as the toboggan gets more and more momentum,
But I think that's hold on a second. I think that's actually the reason why Robert Kennedy was taking on the mafia, because they knew that was the tentacle. That was like tier 2 of the CIA inside the United States. And so if you look at what's happening right now, where they're going after USAID and National Endowment for Democracy and all of these other embedded, and at the same time they're going after the gangs and the deportation and all of this other stuff. And there's been a whole bunch of money laundering arrests. They're going after the money supply here, and so again, it has to be a whole. And people said, there was a lot of people that have wondered why, since it was the mafia and the deal with Joe Kennedy to get JFK elected, why Bobby would go after the thing that got them there. And I think they had tried to begin mapping that network. And I think that's exactly why he was going after them, because they were trying to do a whole of government sweep up, as you pointed out, get us out of all of the wars and bring all of that back home, and to try to change our approach. I think he genuinely thought the Peace Corps would be a good thing. Obviously, it was corrupted as well, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah. Ron, real quick, and then I want to go to Illini.
Yeah, no, you're good. I was just going to say, I was reading Sutton, and he was talking about how Israel was primarily giving weapons to Iran, and they were the main purveyor of sending weapons all over the Middle East and everywhere. And when I heard that, in a way, it almost kind of gave me a little bit of peace, because it's like I know it sounds frightening, but at the same time, it's like, to me, it's all controlled and it's all contrived to keep everybody in a state of fear. I don't think the ultimate objective is the destruction of the world. The ultimate objective is the destruction of liberty in the world.
Well, I don't know. They only want 500,000 people, so that's a lot of dead bodies. But anyway, Illini, go ahead with your change of topic.
Hey, Colonel, you guys discussed, the Kurt Weldon interview a couple of days ago. I went out and did some research on some stuff, to follow up on some of this. The first is that, I guess if there's one takeaway, Kurt Weldon cited the Bravo 7 video, and I've pinned a link to that, up in the nest. And
Thank
this
you.
is where a whole bunch of, architects,
Yep.
engineers and firefighters kind of go through everything and kind of make the case for why they think, rather than it being a building collapse, this could have been a demolition, particularly of the World Trade Center. I watched it. I thought it was interesting. I think they make some good points on it. I also think that there's a couple of different models of the world that could happen. The first is that, for anybody who's watched the Tucker Carlson interview, obviously Kurt Weldon, was this congressman who was, almost going to be the head of the House Armed Services Committee. Really smart, reasonable guy. And it's clear that he was retaliated against. And it's clear that it was probably for calling the World Trade Center, commission a whitewash.
Yeah.
I'm with him on that. It's clear also that Philip Zelikow, was definitely in charge of things. There was an interesting clip that I'll get to in a minute that kind of shows the degree of control that he exercised over that, some of the hearings, where I think, but I also think that there's going to be some issues too, and there's a couple of different models of the world. One is that Zelikow pretty much got it right, at least in the grand scheme of things. But because Kurt Weldon, said that they did a sloppy job, he got retaliated against because, obviously the CIA is doing some false flag attacks, and they were worried that Kurt Weldon could disrupt, another cover up, even though this one, they were just kind of sloppy about it and got called out by him, even though maybe they got it right that it was simply a building collapse. That's one model of the world. Another model of the world is that, the engineers and the architects are right. Maybe there was a certain amount of a controlled demolition going on. And then there's models of the world where, potentially both things are kind of explaining things at the same time, because the World Trade Center was a really complicated structure. It wasn't designed a normal way. And trying to model what happened is going to be really tricky to do. And I think the hardest thing, the biggest exculpatory piece of evidence for Zelikow and the people who are alleged to, and the CIA, is the 911 calls from people above the 90th floor. There was one call at 9:37, for instance, that said that they saw a building collapse, that there was a collapse on the 92nd floor. And that may have been part of why everybody, with the fire department and the police department, became concerned about some kind of a collapse issue ahead of time. But more importantly, though, it's also an eyewitness account saying not that there was an explosion in the building, but that there was a collapse. You've also got 911 calls, including one guy, Kevin Cosgrove. And this is all kind of referenced in some of the stuff I've gone through in the Nest, where, Kevin's actually on the phone until the moment of the collapse. I think in Tower 2. And you can hear the first 3 seconds of it. It's kind of disturbing, so be careful if you listen to it. You also have the building engineers who come out kind of swinging and kind of go into detail, saying what they think happened initially. And I mean, my thing about an engineer is this is a guy dealing with a really complicated subject matter. And I don't think he has the time or the energy to front on things. Could be wrong. It would be, quite a feat to pull that off. But
to pull what off?
He's dealing with a really complex system and trying to explain what happened.
Who is he? Who are you talking about? The engineers, the architect?
The building, in this case, let me look it up. It's the third one down in the Nest. It is not Robertson. The article by the New York Times was about Guy Tizzoli.
Okay.
He was a building engineer. He was 88 years old. During the collapse, he was trying to drive through the Holland Tunnel that morning, and he got waved off by the police. The building did collapse at 9:00. So there's that going on. But it does seem like all the engineers at the time kind of came out swinging on this and tried to explain what they thought happened.
Right.
And there was a New York Times article, in September of 2002. So that's what this, demolition narrative is going to have to overcome. They're going to have to overcome people on the phone saying that, there was some kind of a collapse up at 92 before the building completely failed. They're also going to have to deal with the fact that there is the building engineer who has his model of what happens. And I just don't see a building engineer also being able to pull off, what the CIA does too. I think there's a lot of brain power.
What do you mean? Explain what you just said. You don't believe that a building engineer could pull off what the CIA did. What do you mean by that?
I don't think he could be able to. Well, I think it's hard to misdirect and keep a model in your head that is a lie going on a really complicated subject. Not saying it's not possible. It sounds hard to me.
Yeah, I would disagree with that part.
Okay.
Just because of what's at stake for people that participate in the lie.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So the most...
Yeah, you don't have to give the benefit of the doubt here. And
yeah. And I think, interestingly enough, now that we know, I think the one thing that all of this has going for it is it's post-COVID. And I know that sounds...
It's post the New York Post censorship too.
True. But I don't think it's the censorship, because that's more of a passive thing. Your government trying to kill you is something that everybody's lived through now. And I think that completely changes how you look at 9/11 now. And so I think if you had an open forum where the firefighters who actually called in detonations happening and have the expertise to be able to know the difference between a collapse and a detonation, because I could say that same thing if you're just a normal person and there is a controlled demolition going on. You may use the word collapse as a way of describing it, because you would never in your wildest dreams believe that somebody would detonate a building like the World Trade Center. That's not in your frame of reference at all. So
you're right.
Yes. So I think we can't um, put all of the focus on exact wording. As a matter of fact, I'll share with you guys something, since this is every time that I'm on SitRep with CanCon and Alpha. I don't know if you guys tuned in early enough to see their promo leading into their show. It is several of the tape recordings of people that are on those planes. And I thought this the very first time that I heard the recordings. And every time I'm sitting in the proverbial green room, waiting to go on that show, and I listen to them, the entire thing seems staged. They say things that no normal person would say on those recordings. They are talking, supposedly the one woman's talking to her husband, and she's talking as if in the third person. It just is the most bizarre, disorienting conversations that they have, as if they're reading a script of some kind. I know that sounds weird, but I would just encourage you guys, if you have the time, you're bored and you want to go back and listen to those. Again, I do think that just as COVID woke so many other people up, I think now that people have wrapped their head, not everybody, but I think now that a lot of people have wrapped their head around the fact that through the FDA or the CDC or whatever, that your government literally wants you dead. That going back through and having a revetting of 9/11 and a complete disclosure of, again, why would anything on 9/11 be classified? Why? Riddle me that question. If
I completely agree with you.
If our government did not do it, then there would be nothing classified, because you would have everything out in the open saying Saudi Arabia did it, or Afghanistan, or bin Laden, or whatever. They don't have any of that.
Exactly. I mean, I think you've got some stuff to overcome here, though. And my worry is, let's say that the narrative changes on it and they prosecute people on this. I think you have to deal with the phone calls and you have to address them, because
sure,
if the narrative could swing back again, that's the risk. And I think they have to basically, you have to come up with a way to, address the fact that Guy Fazoli comes out swinging, and maybe he's in on it. That could be one explanation. Maybe, I mean, it is a New York Times article. Maybe he could have gotten his narrative straight ahead of time, and maybe they could have been relatively friendly people. And then finally, of course, nobody back then wanted to believe that the government could be behind it. Nobody even thought about it. The government was there to protect us from this stuff.
So there is the one video of the Alaska engineers that talk about the whole thing. And I'm not sure if it was in that video or if I've read it. But before I left active duty, I did read an account, and I forget who sent it to me, that talked about there were certain offices over a multi-year period of time that had been renovated in both towers. And the insulation that had been used in those areas had been, and there's a particular company that it came from, and I don't want to use the word experimental, but some unique insulation that had been embedded with a thermite like material. And the allegation was that once the detonations occurred, that it would have been kind of the trickle down effect that would basically give you the look of it imploding and being a controlled demolition. There again, if you just use common sense and you don't try to get mired down in the details, there have been planes run into buildings multiple times. There has never been a steel building that it collapsed upon itself for any reason at all because of fire. Never happened. Never happened in the history of the world. So there is again, and Elena, you're absolutely right. But I think the inverse is true too. You can get so bogged down in the details of trying to cross every T that you miss the common sense, where I don't need a whole lot of, and I understand what you're saying. In a court of law, you absolutely do. But in order to, I want everything declassified. And
Yes.
I want it all laid out on a, and then you're going to have to convince me that something in that, I want to go about it the exact opposite. You're going to have to convince me that something in that pile of papers that gets declassified does the exact opposite of what we know to be natural properties of steel not burning. So to me, my brain, the logic of my brain, I have to have something that tells me that something happened that was not logical, or I'm going with my logic. So let me get to a couple of the hands.
Let me give you a couple of things, though, that point towards a conspiracy, though, too. I'm giving you the stuff that doesn't.
Okay.
Number one, Philip Zelikow, he's, in charge of the 9/11 staff. There's an interesting segment of this video that I've posted. If you go deep down, if you go a couple of things down for my 9/11 revisited thing, there's a segment of the hearing where they're talking about the emergency response. And what's clear is that Sam Casperson, who's, one of Zelikow's, workers, he's this kid in his 20s at the time. He just came from a couple of years of Sullivan and Cromwell. It's clear that he's in charge of the hearing and not, George Del Grosso, who's actually, giving the presentation there. He's telling George Del Grosso, what line he's supposed to be on and what he's supposed to say. So I found that really interesting to kind of back up, Kurt Weldon's point.
Yep.
And then there's an interesting interview from David Rockefeller, of all people, with the Telegraph.
Yes.
And he's trying to pitch his new book, memoirs, which does talk a little bit about the construction of the World Trade Center.
Yes,
in
it
the whole
does.
Process.
Yep.
But he says two funny things in that interview, and maybe I'm taking things out of context, but you can read between the lines in them if you really want to. Which is, he said, "I watched them go up, I watched them come down."
Yeah.
Well, David Rockefeller was a little bit more instrumental in just watching in the whole process of them going up.
Yes.
So you can kind of, leave certain things to the imagination. And then he also says, I was never really worried about them attacking, Rockefeller Center, where his building, where his office was that day, but it could just be due to a lack of an imagination.
Yeah. Or it could be,
If you read between the lines, this is his sort of
yeah,
tacit statement about it. And if you can read even further between the lines too on it, but that's kind of interesting. And the other thing, of course, is the whole Silverstein purchase.
Yes.
And how he got that thing.
Yes.
Originally Ford NATO was going to be able to get the World Trade Center lease.
Yes.
And and interestingly enough, I think their financier was J.P. Morgan Chase, which was Rockefeller's bank.
Yeah.
At the last minute, they pulled out on some of the terms. We don't necessarily know if it was the financing or what, but they pulled out in March. And then the Port Authority, went back to Silverstein Properties, and they wound up getting it. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that happened here, but if I'm going to reopen the investigation, the first thing that I want to go back through all the forensics, which they never really did. They're going to have to go back to Fresh Kills and actually take a look at what's down there. And then they're probably going to have to talk to some of the Rockefellers and maybe, they're going to have to talk to the Silverstein family.
Yeah.
And the prom.
Yeah.
And understand what happened.
Yep. I agree. Cousin Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just, he mentioned the phone calls, and as did you. And the contrived phone calls from the passengers on the planes, I believe that those came from Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. I don't believe that they actually used the planes. There is video evidence, actually, that shows they were holograms. And it's really strange and really bizarre, but there is no explanation other than somebody filmed them. So that's the first thing. I don't think those planes ever left Westover Air Force Base. If they actually left, they were empty and they were being flown remotely, because the pilots have already said there's absolutely no way that those planes could have done what they did by human hands. So that's the first thing. The second thing is if they can bullshit a bunch of phone calls for, quote, passengers on the planes, they can absolutely bullshit the phone call from the 92nd floor. And there's no doubt in my mind that if anybody says, oh, the building's collapsing, right, that's pretty specific. If you're on the 92nd floor, which is above where the planes hit, if I recall.
Yes.
You're not collapsing. I don't believe that was a phone call that somebody made from the building. I just don't believe it, because, they're not going to use the term collapsing. At least would you?
Look, the audio forensics could wind up proving, it could wind up tilting against them. If it turns out that, the phone call was placed, from the Port Authority or from, Washington, D.C., things get very interesting very fast.
Yep. I agree. Miles, go ahead.
I want to go back to having the public believe a new narrative besides the one that was put out there. My best friend grew up in Hell's Kitchen, and we've known each other for 40 years. So I can't bring the subject up. Now, during COVID, like you were talking, Colonel, he knew about 2 or 3 days into it that it was BS. And we were talking about that, and I said, well, who do you think's doing this? And he goes, well, it's our government doing this to us. And I said, John, these are the same people that were involved in 9/11. And that was the end of the conversation. He went, no, that's not true. Our government would not do that to us. They wouldn't do that in New York. And I went, John, they're doing it again to us. So also there's another video out there called Beyond Bravo 7. It's quite a bit longer, but you might want to watch that one too. Thanks,
okay.
Colonel.
Sure. Southern, go ahead.
I was down there after 9/11, had to fly and see a client, and the chief medical officer got pulled in to help on the ground because he was down there when it happened. So he was pulled in to help out the firemen, the police officers. They had to be federal state employees, the way they were set up, to triage. And he took me as far as I could go. It's nothing like you imagine on TV. It is, I will never lose that vision of that moment when I saw. But my question is, there is no way those planes can implode those buildings. They had to have charges set to implode. I have seen buildings come down where they're going to completely rebuild, and they have to do them in an implosion type way because they got buildings on the other side. And that never made sense to me. But I got to tell you, I got a little like shiver up the spine when they were showing Jeffrey Epstein's place. You saw the picture of Bill Clinton in the blue dress. And the next one was George Bush Jr. sitting on the floor looking like he was in the Oval Office playing blocks. And if you look at the blocks, it would build the Twin Towers.
Right.
I know the Bushes were in financial trouble. That's why Iraq was so important. And Dick Cheney with Halliburton. I believe our government was involved. And no one's been able to prove they weren't involved. And I believe that 100%. I went down every rabbit hole. For the grace of God, I had 8 people that were supposed to be there. I own an executive search firm. I had 4 candidates that were supposed to be there for interviews. What happened is 2 of them got stuck on the subway. And the other 2 found out about it, but couldn't call me because you couldn't call. You couldn't call out from New York City area. It just did a fast busy. And I had 2 of my employees had family working in the building, and I had 2 other friends in those buildings. None of them were there. And there was one had a broken tooth, and the other he's at IBM that manages the federal, the state, the retirement funds and stuff. He was supposed to be there to negotiate, and his president called and said, I need you in White Plains because someone is sick and I need you to run that meeting. You're going to have to reschedule. And they should have been there. It just was freak accident, so they weren't there. Just a little thing changed that caused a different domino effect. But I do believe our government was involved, and I think our country deserves to know that. We have what 9/11 did to our country was astonishing. I couldn't believe how many people moved out of New York because our phones were ringing off the hook looking for pathways to careers outside of New York City and the perimeter areas. But at the end of the day, we as American citizens deserve to know, and all who lost family members, they should know. They should know. And I think we have that right because we don't trust our government. Trump's doing what he can to a point, but we have a government that doesn't work for us. And through Colonel, I've now realized the CIA has never, ever worked for us, the American citizens. And I think we deserve answers, especially those who have lost family. This has to be on the table with Trump.
Right. So I'm going to close with this. One of the people that came across my radar in the last 2.5 years was Porter Goss. I've written quite a bit about him. Fascinating guy who ends up being in charge of the CIA. On 9/11, if you go back through his history, he has a very interesting history, and how he got into Congress is also very interesting. And he was a co-sponsor of the Patriot Act, and obviously has a lot of intelligence connections, and War Hamster would appreciate the fact that he graduated from Yale. He was in a really weird secret society called Book and Snake, and he was part of a fraternity with William H.T. Bush, which is William Henry Trotter Bucky Bush, the youngest brother of former, uh, uh, let's see, George H.W. Bush. And his connections to all of this is crazy. He was an ambassador appointed by Bush Sr., director of national intelligence. And he says that he was recruited by the CIA at Yale in his junior year. So he's never not been in the CIA, and he just so happens to be in Congress on 9/11 and co-sponsors the Patriot Act. So, and then as a reward for having done such a great job, he gets appointed to be the director of the CIA. So, again, I want everything declassified. And someone needs to explain to all of us how our government in a free and open society, cough, cough, would classify anything about a terror attack on the United States unless it implicates them. So, because they no longer deserve the benefit of the doubt now that we know that the CIA has sponsored terror attacks for the last 70 some years since they began in 1948. And if you guys think for 1 second that the same organization that has created terror attacks and overthrown over 90 governments wouldn't do that here after they've experimented on us, after they've unknowingly drugged people, committed all kinds of heinous experiments on orphans, y'all have not learned anything. So they're definitely capable of doing it. Now what we have to do is look at what the evidence is, as Illini has mentioned, and because they're definitely capable of doing it. Their actions has killed millions of people. 3,000 is a drop in the bucket compared to what they have done all over the world. So anyway, we're going to close it up with that on a happy note. So again, tomorrow we are going to be discussing a British Cold War think tank and the Institute, which is the Institute for the Study of Conflict. It it'll make you chuckle, not in a good way though. All right, so see you then. Take care, everyone. Okay, that was an unexpected turn, talking about 9/11. What famous politicians went to Phillips Andover Academy? Oh, we've done quite a few of the prep schools into the secret societies in the college fraternities. And Phillips Andover is one that comes up repeatedly in some not so great ways. Let's see. Somewhere today on X, a post was made about being 18 or 1.8 or 2 billion people more than they thought. Yeah. They definitely believe in the whole eugenicist and being able to cull the herd, which is why all of their doctors are veterinarians. Howard Lutnick was taking his son. Yep. Yeah, lots of information about 9/11. We are going to I think it's all going to be declassified, and we're going to finally put that baby to rest. So thanks everybody for being here. I appreciate it. I'll see you tomorrow.